G'day and welcome to episode 8 of the CTO Life Line. That's the monthly live stream conversation dedicated to helping CTOs thrive. I'm co-host Daniel Walters, and there is Noah, my co-host. Noah, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. It's been a good week for me.
We've got some sort of lurgy in the household, but we are surviving. Next week, we'll be back to thriving, I'm sure of it. Today, we've got a pretty interesting topic. So, today's episode is, are biases getting between us and success? But first, before we jump into that, Noah, maybe we've got some housekeeping.
To help other people find the show, please follow us at the CTO Lifeline LinkedIn page and the CTO Lifeline YouTube channel. That way you will also be notified of upcoming episodes and guests, and you can help us access people that you think need to see the show.
But without further ado, let's bring on today's really special guest, Dr. Dani Chesson.
That was a very fancy pronunciation of my name.
I do everything fancy. I like CTO, but fancy. How are you doing today, Johnny?
I am great. Thanks for having me here.
For those who don't know, Dr. Dani Chesson is a human-centered designer who leverages the power of behavioral science to help organizations drive innovation and create change. She's the founder of the Design Thinker Institute and co-host of the Design Thinker podcast.
Thanks, Noah.
Welcome to the show. We met once before at an Agile on the Beach event. I attended a talk that you gave and you shared about cognitive bias. That was a topic that was close to my heart because I felt like what little I had learned about cognitive bias had helped me in my career as a CTO. But I had learned about cognitive bias from very informal sources. And so I'm keen to learn more because I think there's more I could unlock as both a CTO and a CTO coach. And what about you, Noah? What's your connection to cognitive bias?
I think Donnie and I met at the same conference, and we shared a lot of common ground, but I'm not an expert in this field either. My first exposure to formal awareness of cognitive biases came when I read Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman some years ago, and it shaped a large part of how I see the world. There's another piece of information I learned about cognitive biases where just even being aware of them doesn't protect you from them. It can even make them impact you worse because you start having false confidence that you'll see it when it happens. I'm here as a student, an enthusiastic amateur, and I'm really looking forward to this session.
That's a great way to put it. So let's jump in with a very broad-ranging question, which is, what is cognitive bias and how does it impact our decision-making?
Sure. So biases are everything. It impacts everything, really. So I think Noah's explanation about it, that Daniel Kahneman's book, changing your outlook on life, that's what cognitive biases do. So to understand biases, we've got to understand our brains. It's suggested that we encounter about 11 million bits of information per second. The adult human makes about 35,000 decisions a day. And if we had to be conscious about all of those things, we would be exhausted probably within the 10 minutes that we're awake, right? So what our clever brains have done is it's created a network of shortcuts, which are called heuristics. And what these shortcuts allows us to do is it allows us to fast track some things. So if you think about when you woke up this morning, you probably went through a whole routine of activities that you just knew how to get up and brush your teeth or whatever it is that you do when you first get out of bed. You just go through those and they're not conscious decisions that you make. So that's how these mental shortcuts work. It has a script that it runs, it sees something and it goes, I run this script when this happens. So for the most part, that's a really great thing because heuristics allows us, these shortcuts allows us to navigate all the complexities of life. On the downside, though, is that those shortcuts can cause biases, and that's what we call cognitive biases, because your brain is programmed to think in a way And that wiring leads us down a wrong path sometimes. So this is where you might have the intention of wanting to do one thing, but you actually end up doing something else. I first started to notice this in organizations, and this will be familiar to you, where everybody wants innovation and change, except when you go to do innovation and change, and then nobody wants innovation and change, right? Because we're creatures of habit. We love our status quo. We love stability. We love predictability. But the logical part of our brains realizes actually things have to change, things have to evolve, particularly in business. Like logically, we know that we've got to, as times go on, technology improves, our organizations have to transform. That's the logical part of our brain. But the other part of our brain, while it may not understand that, but that's not what it allows us to do. So there's this.
And it's people might think about bias as being related to some of those really big decisions, but it can, you described it, how many decisions we're making. It can be on those small decisions. So maybe give us some examples of how some of those small decisions might impact our working.
Yeah, this is why, like, when we try to change, so the start of every year, we all make these grand, we go to the gym every day, I'm going to eat salad every day, I'm going to start my day with a protein shake, all good intentions, right? And then what happens is the routine kicks in, right? So you're intending to get up and make a protein shake, but you get up and make coffee. You intend, but that's because that's what your brain has taught you, that look, this is what we do in the morning. So for you to change that, you've got to actively now go, okay, this is what I used to do, but hang on, brain, I'm going to go do something different. That takes a lot of effort. Is that a cat?
Yeah, we've just got another guest on the show that I wasn't anticipating.
Didn't even get a proper introduction.
Yeah, this is our co-host, Ware, one of the most needy cats you might meet. Yeah, she'll probably appear from time to time. So I am interested in that sort of, because you described some like habitual type decisions. When we set those, it's the grand plans at the start of the year, but a lot of those to do with like intentions around habits, but can be really hard to maintain those habits. And so you're saying that cognitive bias can be a factor in that.
Yep, absolutely. And this is why change is so hard for us, right? Because our brains crave stability, predictability, because it sees that as important to survival in the wild. And our neighbors were lions. We wanted to know where our food was coming from. We wanted to know that our food was safe. So all of those things. But even though we live in a modern world now, our brain still, for the most part, operates in that way. So we want that predictability, and our brains are wired towards that predictability. But we live in a world that is constantly changing. So there's this ongoing battle where our habits and our routines take over. At the same time, we know we've got to do things differently.
And my understanding of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that our brains use up a ton of energy.
Yep.
And because of how much energy they consume, most animals' brains have evolved to be lazy, to reduce energy as much as possible. And that's actually where habits largely come from, right? When you do something enough times, your brain recognizes the pattern, and then it automates that pattern so you no longer have to think about it, and therefore it takes less energy.
Yep.
And so the biases are automation, like similar sorts of automation and patterns. And to get out of those requires conscious thought. And as you said, if you consciously thought about everything that you do all day, you would probably die from loss of calories, actually, just considering how much energy it would take to actually do that.
Yep. So if you think about all the things that happen in a day, right? Your brain is responsible for keeping you alive. That requires making sure you're breathing, making sure your heart's beating, your kidneys functioning, your liver's functioning, your digestive system, like all of that takes energy. And then there are things like when I want to move my arm, there's a thing that my brain has to do to make me do that. All of these things are controlled by your brain. So you mentioned Daniel Kahneman's book. It is a life-changing book. So if you have not read it, I highly recommend reading it. What he talks about is this system 1, system 2 thinking. So system 1 is the part of our brain that is automatic, fast thinking. That's where all of the quick decision making happens. And that is the part of our brain that is active 95% of the time. So 95% of the things that we do, the decisions that we make, come out of that automatic part of our brain. System 2 is the slower brain. Think about it like one of those old computers. It takes a while to boot up, hems and haws and ups and puffs, and it requires a significant more energy to use. I often tell people, if you walk home a certain way one day, try deliberately going another way. Like, you feel more tired because it is different. Or when we're trying to learn something new, it's like you feel more tired because our brains are having that 5% that's hardly ever used is having to engage, right? And our brains, as much as possible, wants to conserve energy, because to the brain, like, our work isn't that important. Like, to our brain, is Dani breathing? Has she eaten? Does she have nourishment? There are all these other things that the brain prioritizes over our work.
So let's contextualize this for CTOs and other leaders involved with technology. That can be design, product, it's all relevant. So what can be the consequences of strong bias effects in their decision making, and how might that impact them and their organizations?
We mentioned earlier that heuristics to shortcuts lead to biases, and there's like books and books written on these biases. So as we talk through this, I'll mention a couple of biases. This won't be an exhaustive list, otherwise we'll be here all day. So one of the things that I see happening in the tech world is this concept called sunk cost fallacy. You might have come across that. And it's this idea that because we've sunken X amount of cost to it, we need to hang on to it.
Yep.
Right?
I know that feeling.
Common one for CTO decision making, thinking around legacy systems, all sorts of times it crops up.
And I see this coming up a lot in conversations around tech debt. So when people get into that conversation, I can just see this bias playing out. The way this plays out, it could also be effort or energy. So it could be that maybe you started working on a project or writing a book, and you've got to the point where you're like, actually, this is not a good idea, or this is a crap product, or this book I thought was a good idea, but now that I'm halfway through it, I think it's crap. We don't want to abandon the project because we feel, oh my God, I've invested like years of my life into this, or, this many hours into this. I just need to finish it. And sometimes you do need to finish it, but sometimes you need to know, look, we've got to cut our costs and just move on to the next thing. But this is what that bias does, right? It leans us towards hanging on to something. And so then, because that's comfortable and our brain knows how to do that, we tend to go down that path.
Yeah, it's almost pulling you towards the opposite thing that might be good if you were, say, a startup. So you're a startup, you've got an idea, but you should be, they say, don't be afraid to kill your darling, sort of thing. But this bias may actually prevent us from making those choices soon enough. And so you may go down the wrong track for too long. Noah, do you have some examples that you've seen play out either as you work as a technology leader or with the technology leaders that you work with?
Well, there aren't any tech leaders that spring to mind, but I can tell you about the worst mistake I made in my career, which
That sounds interesting.
definitely was influenced by this bias. I was new into IT. I'd been working for 6 months, so this was many years ago. And this was back in Windows NT, where you had domain controllers, and I was responsible for bringing this new machine up onto the network and making sure that it integrated correctly with the network, because that way we'd be able to scale better, which was something we were interested in, and we'd have more redundancy in case one of the servers that we were using broke. Not a huge project, not something particularly fancy, but I waited until everyone had gone home for the night because I didn't want to disrupt them. And then I brought the new machine online and I couldn't get it to work. And so I brought it up and it wouldn't integrate. and it wouldn't connect. And so I rebooted it and I did it again. And then I did it again, did it for maybe 3 or 4 times. And then I decided the configuration on the new machine looks good. And so what must be wrong here is the configuration of the old machine. And so then I restarted the old machine and it wiped out our entire network. And it turns out, for those who never worked with Windows NT and were never sysadmins and were never bitten by this, that many years ago, you could only have one main, what was called a primary domain controller. You couldn't bring up a machine that had been installed as a primary domain controller onto another network. And if you did that, the old one would be overwritten by the new configuration on the new system. And I didn't know that. And it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. I just had to get it done. I didn't have time to stop and do research to go and figure out why it wasn't working. I knew what I was doing, and therefore I was going to keep doing it until it worked. And then it didn't work. And not only didn't it work, it took down the network for every employee in the company. I then had to stay for the rest of the night and explain to my CTO what had happened when they came in the next day. They were far more forgiving than I think I had a right to expect. And they helped me fix it. And there were some people in the company who helped me fix it. But it was very much a case of I was committed to doing this. And when it didn't work on that evening, I tried to force it through. So sunk cost fallacy of time, right? I'd spent 3 hours trying to make this happen. And so rather than back out and go home and come back when I was fresh and research what went wrong, I just forced it through.
Every engineer on the planet must have experienced this numerous times. Like, just trying to solve a bug or something like that. We've all banged our heads against the desk at some point and recognized too late that we've been doing it for too long. Great example.
That was a great example of sunk cost and time.
Do we want to pick another cognitive bias and share that and then come up with some examples of that affecting CTOs and other tech leaders?
So another common one that I see in organizations is loss aversion. So what the research shows on this is that the pain of loss for humans is like twice as bad as when we gain something. So this is why if we have to make a decision on, we're going to move to this new platform, this whatever, and life is going to be so amazing. It's like faster, better, cheaper, whatever the thing, but we're afraid of walking away from the thing that we have. We feel that loss, right? We feel that thing going away much more severely than we do the thing that we're going to gain. This is also, people have told me this, like when they've sold a house and they've bought a house, the pain of leaving their old home feels much more painful than the joy they feel when they come into their new home. This keeps us from letting go of things that we just need to let go of and moving into new spaces and new things.
The principle of you ain't going to need it seems somehow connected to loss aversion.
I could see you ain't gonna need it as invented as a subconscious attempt to avoid loss aversion. So by not building things that you don't need, you don't then get attached to things that you then have to throw away. And so the more we write, software is a liability, all software is a liability. The more we write, the more attached to it we get, the harder it is to get rid of it, even when we know it's the right thing to do.
I feel like there's a connection with a cognitive bias I was keen to discuss with you, Dani, which is certainty bias. Because I feel like loss aversion, with the example of the house, you know the house that you've been living in really well. And the new house, you don't know what sort of, you're moving hopefully for some benefit, but there's a bunch of things that you don't know about it. And can you tell us a little bit about certainty bias and maybe the different ways it's known? Because I think a few different biases play into that.
Yeah. So first, it's called ambiguity aversion is how I would describe that. And it's that our brains actively try to avoid ambiguity. It does a pretty crap job at it because most of our world, if you are living in the 21st century, you deal with ambiguity probably on a moment-to-moment basis. Our existence is very ambiguous. But our brains don't like that. Remember earlier I said that our brains are designed predictability, certainty. We crave certainty and stability. Ambiguity is very unsettling. So our brains are always seeking for certainty. And this is why we tend to take the option that we know, even if it's a bad option. There's a tendency to lean towards the options we know than the options we don't know. And this is, again, why change is so difficult for us. But also in organizations, this leads us to some poor decision making, because we tend to favor the thing that we know and we're familiar with, even though that might be the wrong option. We don't know what it's going to be like. We don't know, is it going to work? Is it not going to work? Our brains don't deal with that well. So if somebody says you've got to make a decision right now and those are the two options, I'm most likely going to choose the option that I know the most about. So there's like familiarity bias in there. The things that we know, we tend to gravitate towards.
Is that similar to the impact of anchoring? Like the anchoring effect?
Yeah. So the anchoring effect, for those that are not familiar, is that the first piece of information, the first thing that you know about something is the thing that you're going to hold on to. So if I told you that, and then that's what you use to measure all the other things. And so you use that as the benchmark.
So there's an example I'm thinking of, which is there's faster over the short term and there's faster over the long term. And those can be two different things. And there's almost a tendency for people and teams to go for options which feel faster over the shorter term, but could in effect be shortcuts. And by the same token, they might avoid options which may have a better impact in terms of the pace that they're able to operate. But the payoff is over the longer term, not the shorter term. Would that be an example of certainty bias?
Think about it this way. Our brains are not good at predicting, right? The further away something gets, the more ambiguity it creates for our brains. So that's why we're like, I could do this really quick thing now and see the results and get an outcome, and it has more certainty. So we're always going to pick the thing that our brains perceive to be more certain.
So I've got a graphic that might pair with this, because I think that can be not great over a short period, but I think that's the fact that we're hardwired to this can lead to compounding effects. So this is a graphic that I often use with teams to talk about the effects of repeated decision making, those habitual decisions. And if we are taking that sort of, okay, I know if I do this right now, will be 1% faster over this week, it may lead you to ignore a whole set of options which you still could address that week, but you might need to just take a step with it and find out, is it taking you in the right direction? And the compound effect could be you might end up being more like a team which is that red line rather than a team which is towards that green line, where you may have to wait a little bit longer for the payoff, but the overarching where you could get to may be better performance.
For a team to operate in that green line, you're asking them to engage that 5% of the brain I talked about, right? Because that quick thinking, decision making systems one is going, obviously, quick now is the answer. But to think long term requires booting up that old machine and getting it going and getting it energized to go, step back. Let's talk about this. Let's think this through. How is this going to look? That's why this is hard, is that it's requiring that part of the brain that takes more energy.
I think there's a lot of truth in that for teams that are coming to this for the first time. And in fact, I was working with someone just the other day who has a team that is really struggling to embrace different ways of working. Despite kind of accepting intellectually that they'll be better, they don't want to put in any of the effort necessary to actually make the change. But I've also worked with teams that are already on the other side of this. And I had the pleasure of doing that a number of years ago, and it really showed me what's possible. Once you've developed habits out of the things that make things faster over the long term, and you've done them enough so they're just automatic, they'll migrate into system one. They'll be treated as habits in there. And then faster over the long term becomes the default. And you look at things that are faster over the short term and they seem insane. Why would you do things that way when you can do things this other way?
Yeah. So this is what's interesting about our brains, right? So the same things that hold us back, habit, biases, they can actually also, if we figure out how to flip them and tweak them, they can actually help us move forward as well, right? So it's, again, context matters when it comes to our brains. Our brains are highly contextual. Habits can be really good, but habits can also be really bad in terms of hindering us. The other fascinating thing about our brains is it's reshapeable. So the research in the field of neuroplasticity, we've learned that our brains can rewire and learn new things and do new things. They're very trainable, and that doesn't stop at any age. Till we stop breathing, our brains will keep learning and changing and growing. So it has the potential to do that.
Yeah, and so just reflecting on the conversation I had with the CTO, it really resonates a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today, in that there's a temptation to attribute kind of culpability to not changing to the individuals in the teams because they're continuing to do what they've always done. But we're biologically wired to actually do the things that we've always done. And so the activation energy for change is really high. And so then we reach a point where, left to themselves, I think few people will go on that journey. There often needs to be some external force that pushes them in that direction, that kind of makes them go on this journey. Whether that's, and for some organizations where I've done it, it's the organization's in danger of going out of business, and so it has to change, and they accept that. And in some cases, even that's not enough. I've worked at places that were in danger of going out of business and still refused to change and do things differently. And so, like, it indicates quite how hard it is to go on that journey.
We've even seen scenarios where they've done research and, where like people with like, they're told, take this medicine and stop eating this because it's literally killing you. And they can't, right? So there is this anchoring power of these things. But I want to come back to something you said about the team that made the transformation versus the team that doesn't. So one of the things that you can do when a team or an individual, somebody needs to change, they have to be able to see what's possible. Our brains don't like ambiguity. So if everybody's working in this way and you want them to work in this way, as much as possible, you've got to create that vision so that the brain can start seeing what that looks like. And then the more that you can see it, and the more, this is why like visuals and language conversations really matter. Much of our behavior change happens through conversation, visualizing, right? So if we start seeing ourselves working differently, the behavior starts to align. If we start talking about the way we're working differently, the behavior starts to align.
Yeah, I feel we've arrived at the critical part of the conversation for CTOs and other tech leaders, which is navigating bias. And I really want to spend a significant portion of today's episode on this. So in my experience, it completely maps to what you're saying. Help people see, make it more explicit, visual, draw more of the connections. So I'd like to share an experience that we had with some significant change whilst I was CTO and CIO at Seek Asia. So we knew that it was two companies coming together. There was going to be change, and everyone knew there would be change just by virtue of two competing companies being acquired and becoming one company. And the way that we, not immediately, but eventually started to manage change was to use this approach, dynamic reteaming, which was we would communicate not just the vision, but we would pitch what was the new shape of teams, what was their mission going to be, what were the skills and competencies that they needed. And the theory behind that, in addition to some of the thinking around cognitive bias, was people who felt ready and were like the early adopters could put their hand up and say, hey, I'm interested to participate in that.
Mm.
But the benefit for everyone else was they could observe what the experience was like for the early adopters. And so with that, over time, came more comfort and familiarity with just exactly what was going to be involved in these changes. And for us, that was a revelation in approaching change. And I had experienced lots of change across my career, and I hadn't ever seen it quite done that way. Is that sort of what you're describing? Is that sort of some of the evidence that you can create for people?
Yep. So specifically what you're talking about, what you're doing in that example is like the people that were ready could sign up. That's creating
Mm-hmm.
social proof, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is creating, so somebody like me is out there doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I can do it too. And then they're getting to observe it in almost a safe way. The reason that social proof is really effective is as humans, we are a herding species. We want to be in the in group. We have a need to herd with each other. It's a protective mechanism. So we are also taking cues from our peers. And we don't want to, like, moving away from the pack is a very risky thing. And I know these are not things like if I told somebody you're not moving away from the pack because you're scared, they're probably going to come at me for it, which is fine. But that is what we do. And it's not something we do consciously, but it is what we do, which is why anytime you step out and you try to do something that no one else is doing, it is scary. But if you have those people that are ready for those things and you can put a spotlight on them, they're creating the social proof and making that new thing safe. There's the whole concept behind early adopters, right? And why we need them to be talking about the thing, because the more that they talk about it, then that starts to shift the language, right? And then the new thing becomes the normal thing.
Mm. Now, have you had similar experiences or other events that you suspect may have been connected to cognitive bias?
Well, the example that Donnie just gave reminded me very strongly of having teenage kids. And teenage kids, at least mine, want to fit in. And so for the entirety of their childhood, they develop their own opinions. They would figure things out for themselves, and we would obviously have a heavy influence on them as their parents. As they're getting older, I can see our influence dropping and the influence of their peers increasing, because they will come home with opinions about things that don't make any sense at all to me. And when we discuss them, they don't make any sense to them either, but they still hold them. And it's because of that exposure to a peer group that holds a collective opinion. And if you were to go to that group and try to find out where that opinion originated, you might not even be able to do it. But socially, they've come to this viewpoint that they all now share and are reluctant to get rid of.
Had an experience like this morning. We were dropping off Henry's cousin to school, and then they've all got blue uniforms, and he's got like a green one. And so he's feeling it's the single person out. He wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible.
But there's a lot of survival need for us to fit in, right? And I know that doesn't exist in the modern world necessarily, but our brains are still pretty prehistoric. We live in the 21st century with 18th century brains, right? It's a very scary thing if you're out in the savannah with lions roaming around for you to stand out. Like, you want to be part of the pack and meld in and not look different. And that those things still translate to the modern world. Teenagers are a little different because they've got all kinds of interesting brain development, hormonal things happening. But that need to belong is something we all share as humans. We want to feel like we belong to something, whether it's family, school. It's just that when you get to the teenage group, they just want to belong to their little pack of crazy ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But
So
that need to belong is something that we all share. Sorry.
as technology leaders, how else can we navigate cognitive bias? So what are practical things that we could do and start applying like tomorrow?
One thing to think about is, so I talked about loss aversion earlier as in the negative thing, right? One of the things that we don't do when we talk about change or needing to do something different is talking about what do we have to lose. We tend to frame things on what do we have to gain, but if our brains don't favor gains as much as we do loss, then what happens if we also start bringing in this is what we've got to gain if we do this, but here's what we're going to lose if we don't. So that is a reframing. So how might we think about reframing things so that it is easier for our brains and it's working with our brains rather than against it? That's an example.
That's a really good example.
I want to add another one to that, which is the reason that marketing works is familiarity, right? You repeat something over and over again, and people become, most people, not everybody, becomes more receptive to it. And so as a CTO, if you're talking about, if there are new habits and new behaviors you want to introduce, then talking about them all the time makes a difference. I've definitely fallen prey to this. When trying to introduce change, I would talk to the group that I want to do something new and tell them about what we were going to do. And I would tell them once, and then I'd go back to doing the stuff that I was doing, and I would expect that telling them once was enough. But that's not, as we've learned, that's really not how our brains work. They're not wired for that. That something new is threatening. It's scary. It means getting rid of something old. So it triggers all of those biases. If you want to be more likely to succeed, you've got to talk about this new thing over and over again until it becomes the default way of seeing things by the group, at which point the group becomes more open to doing it, to trying it, to experimenting.
And to add on to that, Noah, the other thing you could start doing is connecting it to things people already are familiar with.
Okay.
Or talking about it in terms of this is or this is similar to, because then if you start pairing it to something that is familiar, then it stops feeling as scary. I mean, you've got to highlight it as different, it is new, but it's also very similar to, because then it starts to shrink. You know, the gas between the thing I know and the thing I don't know starts to get smaller if we can connect it to things that we're already familiar with.
So the perceived ambiguity decreases.
Yes. Yes. If you think about where you are today is here and where you want to go is here, and the further something goes out, the more ambiguous it is. The more we can close that ambiguity gap, the faster change can happen. But the trick is for us to do that, it requires us doing things like constantly talking about the change, having conversations with people, repeating ourselves over and over again, role modeling the thing that, and then what the trap that leaders fall into is, I don't have time for that. And because you don't make time for that, then the thing that you're trying to achieve doesn't get achieved because you're not doing the thing. It's like we don't want to believe that the things that are going to get us to the thing we want are the things you're avoiding doing.
That's such a critical point. The way I approach that phrase is I ask people, if we replaced I don't have time for this with I do not value X, then what is our view of that? And if we can review that statement and go, hang on, no, but I do value this, then you can rethink, oh, then I will need to make time for it. And so that is a reframe. And then you can start to make time for the work, whether it is to do more than adequate communication. We've said on this podcast before, communicate 5 times in 5 different channels is probably the starting point for leaders communicating anything. Yeah.
There's something else I want to raise that I think is related to that, which is we've talked a lot about biases, and a lot of what we've talked about is a lot of the way it's been framed is the brain is wired to do this or it's wired to do that. And so it sounds binary. It is this way for everybody and it has to be this way. But I suspect there's more of a spectrum, and I'd like to hear a little bit about what you know for kind of the range of responses that we might get for a bias.
Yeah. So when we talk about biases, so when I say we crave stability, status quo, familiarity, all of that, these are generalizations, right? So if you think about it as a spectrum, we all know people that they're quite comfortable navigating change, or that's super creative, that's always trying something new, and maybe they have the opposite problem of sticking to something. As individual humans, we are unique and our brain wiring is unique to us. But the tendencies that we have and the behaviors that come out of them are something we share in common. So all of these biases are something that we experience in common, but the degree to how they show up in our behaviors and decision making varies from person to person,
Okay.
right? Because the brain wiring happens. So as a species, yes, we tend to have a status quo bias. However, we all have very individual life experiences. We're exposed to different things in life, and that also shapes our brains, right? So, as a species, we might be this way, and as a generalization, we might be this way, but our individual experiences, where we grew up, how we grew up, who raised us, who was in our lives, what books were we exposed to, what TV shows, all of those things shape our individual brains. So, some of these biases may apply to you more, some of them might apply to you less.
And actually, I think that's really good, and I appreciate you clarifying it. And I think it really, that then is information that CTOs can then take and recognize that a lot of us treat others and make assumptions about others as if the things that we hold true are the things that other people hold true. So our biases and their biases will match. And it turns out that's often not the case. And in fact, that's why you get early adopters, right? And that's why you get laggards, like different degrees of openness to change and different degrees of bias.
Yep.
But it means that as a CTO, if you think you've done enough to overcome a bias, maybe you have for someone who holds the same degree of that bias that you do, but it doesn't mean you've done enough for your teams. And
Yes.
that's, I think, a level of awareness that we need CTOs to have, is just accept that some people are going to need a lot more than you do. Their response and the way you treat them is going to have to be different.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, so many good things to unpack there. No. So the whole team doesn't change at the same pace. And the other thing that we have expectations around is that people are going to adopt to change, or whatever the thing that's happening is, everybody's going to do it at once, and everybody's going to do it according to the timeline that you've decided. But behavior and people don't change according to your little project timeline. As a leader, we can help move that along. We can encourage it. We can guide them. But that takes effort on our part. And we can influence that, but we cannot dictate it. I did want to throw something else in there, back to the point about how we talk about these are the things that you need to do to change behavior, but we're all too busy to do them. Another thing that we're not very good at is this idea of subtraction. So we want to have this big transformation. We want to do this cool, innovative thing, but we don't go, for us to do this, we've got to stop doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Our brains are better at adding things up than cutting things out.
Yeah, it's an actual choice, right? So to do the new thing, we can make the choice to stop the other thing, and you can get the benefits of more focus, more chance of succeeding on the thing that you've realized was important and an imperative for you.
Yep. But then the stopping the thing brings us back to loss aversion.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I was just about to say, is that we're talking about CTOs seeing the bias in others, but the unwillingness to put in the time, that's a result of other biases that we're holding ourselves.
I'd like to pick up on the point around ambiguity, because in my career, I've been known as someone who could deal with a lot of ambiguity, but it's not my preferred state, because even if I am navigating it, it is a higher cognitive load and a higher stress state because of all the reasons that you've given. And being more aware of that means we can also be more aware of supporting our teams and getting into good flow states, and that means they can also socialize and collaborate more successfully.
It's a keen reminder to me as well, because actually I adore ambiguity. I can roll in ambiguity all day and absolutely love it. And I sometimes forget that lots of people don't like being there. And it's because I'm projecting my comfort level with ambiguity onto them.
Yeah. And also there's another dimension to this, right? So I can deal with ambiguity in certain parts of my life. But if somebody comes in here and like moves that book off that shelf and puts it somewhere else, I will lose my
That is so
so
true.
my husband and I will have these arguments because I don't cope with change in my personal. I like my personal space in life to be very, and so he'll make fun of me. You've made a whole career out of this, and I've moved this one plate, and now you're like having a meltdown. But so our brains are also very contextual. So you can perform in a certain way or be okay with something, and this is why this is so complicated, right? And this is why it's sometimes hard to predict how our brains, what somebody's going to do or how brains are going to react in certain situations, because our brains have already created these conditions where X behavior is okay in this environment, but not in this environment.
Absolutely. And maybe a topic for the next time we have you back on, because there's a whole thing around like growth and fixed mindset, which I have a bit of an issue about how that's framed for this reason, because I've observed people who accuse others of being a fixed mindset. But this chat has gone so quickly. We're at that wrap up stage, and so we're going to try and do a quick replay. I'm going to have a crack at it, and Noah and Donnie, please jump in with important details. So we talked about cognitive bias, and we explained what it is. We talked about how it relates to how our brains are wired, and it can impact big decisions and it can impact small decisions. And we translated that for CTOs and tech leaders on the sort of impact that can have on the organizations. I think from the end of this chat, we've realized it could impact just about every decision and can have really large cumulative effects. So it's a really important topic. And it was no surprise to me that by the end of this episode, we hit on 4 or 5 themes that have been themes throughout the 8 episodes of CTO Lifeline. So Noah, what themes jumped out at you that have been like recurring ones on our show?
Well, we've talked about change a lot. We've talked about it in all sorts of different contexts. And so that's one that continually comes up. But actually, I wanted to highlight a quote that I really enjoyed that I wrote down, and I'm going to go looking for it in the highlights when I send it out, which is, we can influence the rate of change, but we can't dictate it. Thank you, Donnie, for saying it's something I need to remember in a lot of the work that I do. And I think for CTOs who are change focused, that is something that is worth just print it out, put it on your wall, tape it to your laptop, do whatever is necessary to be reminded of that fact every time you try to introduce a change.
Yeah, write it on your palm so you can
get it tattooed backwards on your forehead so you see it every morning when you go into the bathroom to brush your teeth.
Yes.
If we were to play through some of the other things that CTOs and tech leaders can take action with. So we mentioned communication and don't be afraid to repeat yourself. Don't be afraid to repeat yourself.
Repeat yourself.
Let's
repeat yourself.
Social proof. And we gave some examples of that. Using visual connections and vision and connection to mission and those things.
See it to be it.
See it to be it. I love it. We mentioned reframing with the loss aversion. How could you see the other side of the equation, make that more explicit, and that might improve your decision making? And then to Noah's quote just before, that the response to that is to be more dynamic and responsive as leaders. So it will take the time it takes. And what can we put in place to be sensing where the team is at, how are they dealing with a change, and what additional support do they need?
I'd like to add 2 things.
Please.
One is, it will take the time it takes. However, when people start having really good experiences with change, their ability to change faster will get better. So it's going slow to start with, and understanding that as you do this over and over again, it will get faster and faster.
Sharing those stories, right?
And the second thing that leads to this is that one of the ways that we can really avoid falling into the bias trap is actually slowing down. and taking the time to reflect. Like reflection is probably the antidote, but not, we have to accept that we are going to fall into them no matter how much about biases. Like I still fall into them. And I've been studying this for like 10 years now. But reflecting, right? It's reflecting on what did I intend to do and what have I done? And that constant loop and taking time to do that with yourself, with your team, together as a team, individually as a team, that repeating reflection.
Yeah, and being quite deliberate about whether it's small decisions or larger important decisions, about the process for making a decision, because that can give you the opportunity for some of that reframing and bringing in other elements and getting views in that might
And
give
the
us a little bit more
practice
protection.
and the practice happens in the small decisions,
Mhm.
right? Like the things that we do in the small decisions are the things that we do in the big decisions.
So we
So
make
paying
more small
attention.
decisions.
Fascinating. All right. Well, we're at that point. So Noah, where can we find you? And what have you got to share?
Find me at noahcanto.com. I'm actually going to be running a webinar next week on Monday for Pacific and UK times, and on Tuesday morning, New Zealand time. It's about the 3 keys to being an outstanding tech leader. So if you're curious, you should absolutely show up. Where can we see you guys?
You can find me at greatcto.me, and you will find a link there, which is for a group CTO coaching cohort. I'm focusing on Southeast Asia at the moment. So if you're in Southeast Asia and interested in getting together with other like-minded CTOs for some group coaching, which in my experience is sometimes even more effective than individual coaching, then check out that link, or you can just find it linked off the front page of my website. Donnie, what about you? What would you like to plug?
Sure. So I am a podcaster as well. So there's
Oh.
I did this
Oh.
backwards, didn't I?
No, that's
Totally
right.
screwed up your flow.
I had a quick touch. I needed that slow thinking on my index finger.
Talk about disrupting your habits. Design Thinker Podcast. You can go to designthinkerpodcast.com, or it's on Apple, Spotify, and all the big podcast platforms, or on my website, the Design Thinker Institute. You can also find me on LinkedIn.
Excellent. Wow, that was an absolutely fascinating discussion. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, Donnie.
This has been awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, everyone, we learned a bit about cognitive biases, and I encourage you to read more. Go check out Donnie's blog, Donnie's podcast, and you may find a pathway to thriving as a CTO. So until next time, bye-bye.